Welcome everyone to our annual Underground Railroad lecture. Before we begin, I just wanted to make a plug for the Friends of Fort Negley. The Friends of Fort Negley are the entity that make these educational events possible, including this incredibly prestigious lecture that we have every year. We have one of the former lecture givers, Jane Landers, in the back. Welcome. This year, I'm incredibly excited because we have someone who is a contemporary of last year's speaker. So being able to hear people who have studied together, thought together, and fought together, I've seen it firsthand, is really wonderful. So last year we had Professor Thavolia Glimp from Duke University, who talked about Black refugeeism here in Nashville during the Civil War and after as well. This year, we have Professor Richard Blackett. He is the Andrew Jackson Professor of History Emeritus at Vanderbilt University. And it's such an honor to be able to introduce him because he was one of my mentors and a little bit responsible for my PhD because he did sign off on it. So now you know who to complain to. And of course, my advisor Jane Landers in the back also signed off on it, equal blame. So if I were to sit here and talk about the awards, the publications, all of the positions that Professor Blackett has held in some of the country's most important and prestigious organizations for the study of history, we would take the whole hour and then he wouldn't get a lecture. So unfortunately, I can't recount his CV here. But what I can say is that he has had a field-shaking career. His work on Black fugitivity, on abolitionism, and other anti-slavery activism has really transformed the way most historians think about the contributions of Black people, not only to ending slavery and the Civil War, but toward nation building, toward Reconstruction, and toward transformation of the Union as our country knew it. His latest book is a biography of the abolitionist labor leader, Samuel Ringgold Ward, and it really continues this legacy. So we're just incredibly privileged and honored to have Professor Blackett here with us today. So you know what? I know he has a lot to say, so I'm going to stop here because I wrote so much. I wrote so much, and really there's nothing I can say to prepare you for how wonderful Professor Blackett's research, viewpoint, and just delightful presence is. So please give it up for Professor Blackett.
No. Thank you, Angela. This is slightly different from advertised, but you will see it has the same bearing. I'm going to test out some new ideas on you today, so consider yourself guinea pigs in this effort to try and understand what I think is one of the more critical and important aspects of the Underground Railroad. And that is the people who defied law and tradition and came into the South to aid slaves to escape. So those are the crazies that I'm interested in, as you think. On an early spring afternoon, almost 1 year to the day before the outbreak of the Civil War, a large pine box was thrown onto the platform of a train station in Seymour, Indiana. The impact caused the box to shatter, and out fell a black man who was immediately arrested. The box had traveled by train from Nashville, Tennessee to Jeffersonville, Indiana, on its way to Cincinnati. As it turned out, the black man was a slave from Nashville. Long before the train reached Seymour, the slave's owner had wired authorities in Louisville, Kentucky to be on the lookout for Alex, who, as he later told an inquiry, was assisted in his efforts to escape by Nathan James, a free black, Al Savage, a slave who had lived relatively freely in the city for many years, and by an unnamed white man. James, a 51-year-old mulatto, was born in Virginia. Al Savage was enslaved to his father. The white man many suspected was from Cincinnati. Alex, a sheet metal worker who attended the same church as James, had paid the white man $60 and a silver watch to cover the cost of his escape. James had procured the box And he and Savage made sure that the box addressed to Levy Coffin in Cincinnati got to the Nashville office of the Adams Express Company. Alex was returned to his owner. Savage was sentenced to receive 15 lashes. James was bound over to appear at the next session of the court, where it was discovered that he was not free, but in fact was an escaped slave living in Nashville for some years. The white man who traveled with Alex all the way to Seymour fled from the train at that point. Alex's bid for freedom may have failed, but its organization and the people involved in its execution had been a thorn in the side of the slave system for almost 3 decades. The incident gives us a glimpse into an important feature of the Underground Railroad's operation in the South. The enslaved working alongside free blacks, both of whom chose to stay behind, and a mysterious outsider who, it is assumed, came into the state expressly to induce Alex to escape. We have no way of knowing why, with any certainty, if the white man had come to Nashville with a plan already developed, if he joined a plot hatched by Alex and his black helpers, or even if he was a northerner who had moved south. It is precisely this sort of uncertainty about the nature and scope of these sorts of arrangements that drove local authorities in border states to distraction as they tried to fashion measures to counter such activities and to protect property. Local commentators were convinced they saw the hand of the Underground Railroad at work. This conviction, however, masked a level of anxiety that above all else exposed the vulnerability of the system, a weakness that the enslaved and their supporters, both in and out of the slave states, regularly exploited. Even if Alex's claim of assistance from a white man was a ploy to lessen the punishment he expected, authorities in the border states, such as Tennessee, did not need to be convinced, for Northern abolitionists, black and white, had a long history of coming south to induce slaves to escape. Their activities complemented the work of slaves and free blacks such as Savage and James, who over the years had forged a local support network to aid escaping slaves get to the north. Some fugitives worked on their own or in partnerships with family and friends to escape, but others leaned on the support arm of the network, which took different forms in different localities. Some were made up of free blacks, others of slave, and yet others of free and enslaved blacks and sympathetic local whites. After a rash of escapes from Norfolk, Virginia, for example, an observer spoke of the existence of a society among the slaves whose sole aim it was to aid the enslaved to escape. One Richmond newspaper editor suspected the equivalent society in his city was made up exclusively of free blacks. Elsewhere, there was ample evidence that local whites were integral to these efforts, as were Northerners resident in the South. But whether the problem was the work of the enslaved acting on their own or with the assistance of local supporters, what troubled commentators the most were signs of outside interference. Such vulnerability created an element of paranoia. Behind each escape, many were convinced, was some outside force without which the slaves would have been largely content with their lot. The paranoia was not always misplaced. Throughout the border states, the area from which the largest number of slaves escaped, local authorities had ample evidence to support this claim of outside interference. Following a string of escapes, one frustrated Virginia editor first warned and then pleaded with his readers to be more vigilant. Abolitionist emissaries were everywhere, he reported. They came as coal porters, booksellers, track agents, school teachers, and such like characters who omit no occasion, he said, to poison the minds of our slaves and then steal them. As commercial contacts expanded between the regions, the problem became even more dire. That warning and fear issued in 1850 had deep historical roots. 15 years earlier, an outsider was caught in Nashville with abolitionist literature in his wagon, which local authorities believed he planned to sell and distribute among slaves as a prelude to an abolitionist uprising in the city. It was part of the postal campaign, the brainchild of the American Anti-Slavery Society, aimed at flooding the South with abolitionist literature. To Southerners, it was a fireball in the night. Meetings organized by elites and attended by whites of all classes vowed to resist, and President Andrew Jackson called for a federal law to confiscate abolitionist literature sent in the mail. In July 1835, a mob of 3,000 gathered outside the Charleston, South Carolina post office, where they burned seized mail as well as effigies of abolitionists. 1 month later, the crisis reached Nashville with the arrest of Amos Dresser, an Oberlin College student. Born in Massachusetts in 1812, Dresser was traveling through the Upper South selling Bibles, he said, to finance his education. He and other students at Lane Seminary in Cincinnati had recently moved to Oberlin following a dispute with Lyman Beecher, the principal of the seminary, and the school's board of education over the students' anti-slavery position. The students had recently debated the competing merits of abolition and colonization, which called for the removal of free and manumitted blacks to Africa, and came down squarely on the side of emancipation. These developments troubled the principal, who banned all further discussion of slavery. Students resisted the curb. As a result, 75 left the seminary, many, including Dresser, transferring to Oberlin. Dresser wasn't in town in Nashville long when the authorities grew suspicious and searched his wagon, where they found abolitionist pamphlets among the Bibles. So you cover the Bible with abolitionists, a wonderful idea. They also found letters which mention anti-slavery. Dresser was charged with using the cover of a religious mission to spread anti-slavery messages. It did not help that he had also met with free blacks and some slaves. Dresser was hauled before a 61-member committee of vigilance and safety, made up of many of the city's respectable citizens. The public face of the committee was its secretary, William Hassel Hunt, publisher of one of the city's leading dailies. Born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1830, Hunt moved south to Kentucky, then Florida, before settling in Nashville. Dresser was interrogated for 6 hours. He admitted he had visited Danville and other parts of Kentucky, as well as Gallatin, Tennessee, where he sold a copy of a famous abolitionist tract. That was more than enough, as far as the committee was concerned, to find Dresser guilty of what they call moral turpitude. Why selling literature? Oh well, you can explain it. An odd conclusion given the political nature of the hearing. They also found him guilty of being an active member of an anti-slavery society, as well as possessing incendiary literature, which he planned to sell. It is not clear exactly what state law Dresser broke. Hunt admitted he was not tried for violating any specific state law. There was, in fact, no Tennessee law that prohibited Dresser from having such literature. None of that mattered, Hunt reasoned. Tradition in such troubled times, he argued, trumped law. Where someone, he reasoned, as he said, and this is a quote, in the mind of everyone acquainted with the case is guilty of a most daring and heinous crime, though the technicality of our law itself frees him of the charge in the absence of legal testimony, we think he still merits punishment. Should they have waited, he wondered, until the villains who had infested the whole extent of the slaveholding states have inflamed, misguided, and excited the blacks to murder, arson, and rape before we attempt to arrest their progress? As far as Hunt was concerned, the answer was self-evident. He did not agree, however, with those on the committee who insisted on summary execution of such punishment that went beyond what he saw was law and tradition. Yet punishment there must be. The committee finally agreed to punish the intruder as if he were a slave by whipping Drescher 39 times, which, for those of us who know, for some reason it's a biblical rule to beat people, slaves, 39 times. A student told me it was in the Bible. As somebody raised as a Catholic, we don't read the Bible, so I don't know. Hunt found that a little too demeaning. 39 stripes simply was a step too far, he argued. Given the circumstances, he argued successfully that punishment should be proportionate and reasonable. Hunt took credit for what he called mitigating the punishment to 20 lashes. Drescher was stripped, publicly whipped, and ordered to leave town the following day. It was an apt warning to others who might follow. The Tennessean ended its report of the public chastisement of the naked man with a warning to others. It simply said in bold capital letters, "Beware." The committee was aware that such attacks on its and its city's interests were freighted with larger political significance. The postal campaign by extensions, Drescher's efforts, they knew, bankrolled by Arthur Tappan, the New York City merchant, and other fanatics, as they call them, to spread incendiary materials inciting slaves to revolt. That, they knew, was not what drove the abolitionist movement. In fact, the opponents of slavery explicitly stated that the slaveholders had to be brought to a recognition of their sins by the power of moral suasion, by being shown that the enslavement of human beings violated God's law. Whatever their motives, the citizens of Nashville were convinced that abolitionists were bent on denying them of their property. Because Tappan was a driving force behind the movement, the committee called on the city's merchants to boycott goods sold by Tappan's firm. The citizens should also boycott those who continued to deal with Arthur Tappan. It would be an apt way of expressing their views publicly about those who finance the activities of those bent on destroying the way of life of the people of Nashville. Drescher's sortie into Tennessee, we now know, was part of a more troubling feature of abolitionist activity as far as the South was concerned: clandestine visits by Northerners to help slaves to escape. In his pioneering study of the Underground Railroad, Wilbur Sieber, writing in 1898, called them adventurous liberators. It's a wonderful phrase. I could do lots with that phrase, adventurous laborers, but that's for another time. He argued correctly that while most of those involved in the Underground Railroad were opposed to enticing or abducting or inducing slaves to escape, there were those in the movement who took another view. A way had to be found, they reasoned, to undermine the system from within. According to Alexander Ross, the Canadian physician and ornithologist who made his first foray into the South in the spring of 1857, he said the only effectual way to help the slaves was to aid them to escape from bondage. To accomplish this, it was necessary to go to them and to give them practical assistance. Despite their stated position, many of those who went south were embraced by abolitionists nonetheless. Sebas identifies 20 such liberators, 16 white and 4 black. Over the years, historians have expanded those numbers significantly, yet we will never know the names of all those who undertook this dangerous assignment. And that is one of the aims that the ends I'm trying to get to find out who these people were. Much of what we know about the levels of outsider involvement comes from failed attempts to induce slaves to escape, as the opening scene that I painted. There were many high-profile cases of failure. Near midnight in early December 1848, Richard Dillingham was caught by Nashville's constable at the Cumberland River Bridge with 3 slaves in a wagon driven by a black man he had hired. The 25-year-old Quaker from Delaware County, Ohio, was approached by blacks in Cincinnati, where he had been teaching, to help rescue members of their family held in slavery in Nashville. This was Dillingham's first, and as it would turn out, his last foray into such activity. At his arraignment, Dillingham pleaded not guilty to multiple charges, including stealing, concealing, and harboring slaves. Curiously, no charges were brought against the free black driver of the wagon. Even before his trial began in April 1849, Dillingham decided to stand on principle. Knowing full well the risk involved in trying to free slaves, he was willing to face the consequences. Prior to the trial, his spirits were buoyed by the number of people, he called them the better portions of the citizens of the city, who seemed sympathetic to him. As his trial opened, Dillingham changed his plea to guilty. Before the judge passed sentence, the prisoner pleaded that he was motivated solely by what he called feelings of humanity for the enslaved. He also asked the court to be lenient so he could return to his elderly parents. The presence of his mother and uncle in the courtroom worked in his favor. The jury recommended, and the judge agreed, that he be sentenced to 3 years in the state penitentiary, the least time allowed under state law. The keeper of the prison bristled at such leniency and was determined to show Dillingham the true meaning of hard labor. But he too quickly fell under the spell of the prisoner's personality, especially his willingness to endure his punishment without complaining. Within months, the keeper made Dillingham steward of the prison's hospital, a position which carried with it increased privileges, but there were hidden dangers attending sick prisoners. A cholera epidemic which ravaged the city in 1850 soon reached the penitentiary. Dillingham contracted the disease and died there in June 1850. Dillingham was not exceptional. As far as local observers were concerned, the city and county were infested by what they call bad white men. It's a wonderful phrase, isn't it? Infested by bad white men from outside who came disguised as wolves in sheep's clothing. Haley Curry, an undergraduate who worked with me, estimated that 10% of advertisements appearing in the city's newspapers in the 1850s mentioned the involvement of white men. But white women in the area and throughout the border states also had a hand in helping slaves escape. Lucinda Leggett, described dismissively as a grass woman, and I have not been able to identify what a grass woman is. And I don't think it's the grass that I know. But a grass woman who struggled to make ends meet on small farms in Stewart County, north of Nashville. She decided to try her luck elsewhere in 1858. The crate she brought on board the steamer from a little port called Tobacco Port on the Cumberland River, she claimed contained crockery. While the boat was moored in Louisville, Kentucky, the captain received a telegram from a neighbor of Leggett's saying that her slave had escaped on the steamer. The captain searched the steamer but found no one that fit the description. A few miles out of Louisville, Leggett was seen taking a glass of water to the box. When the glass disappeared and reappeared a few moments later, the captain knew he had had his man. The enslaved was taken to prison in Covington, Kentucky, and later returned to Tennessee. Leggett, it seems, slipped away after the steamer docked in Covington. Down the Ohio River, opposite Louisville, Mary Affleck, a white dressmaker, bought 2 tickets at the Jefferson Railroad Company in early spring 1854 under the name of Mrs. Watts. She also arranged for a hack to pick up Henry, an enslaved man in Louisville, near dawn, and to take him to the ferry. Something went wrong. Henry was caught and Affleck arrested at her home. It was, the local newspaper reported gleefully, the latest and cutest abolitionist dodge. But Affleck was serious. When her home was searched, the police found receipts for a box and 2 trunks that had been sent to Chatham, Ontario. If she intended to travel with Henry, and we don't know this, but it raises questions about a possible relationship, and I want to be careful here, so note my language. A possible relationship that went beyond simply aiding a slave to escape, the sort of relationship that flew in the face of both law and convention, and some would think taste. 3 years earlier, Calvin Fairbank, a Vermont-born Oberlin-trained Methodist minister, was arrested in Jeffersonville, Indiana, for helping Tamar, a 24-year-old slave, escape from Louisville. Friends of Tamar in Jeffersonville feared she was about to be sold. Fairbank met Tamar in Louisville and rowed her across the river in a leaky skiff. He rented a buggy in Jeffersonville, took Tamar to Salem, where he placed her on a train to Indianapolis, and Tamar disappears from history. Fairbank was arrested when he returned the buggy and taken to Kentucky to stand trial. The jury took less than 20 minutes to convict him. He was sentenced to serve 15 years in the state penitentiary. This was Fairbanks' second brush with the law. In 1844, not long after his graduation, he and Delia Webster, who had also attended Oberlin and with whom he ran a school in Lexington, Kentucky, were convicted of helping Lewis Hayden, his wife, Harriet, and their son to escape to Canada. Webster was sentenced to 2 years, Fairbank to 15 years in the state penitentiary. Webster was pardoned 5 weeks later. Fairbanks served 4 years before he was released, following a campaign by the man who he had helped to escape, who raised the enormous sum of $650 to pay his master. And Fairbanks' father's efforts, who traveled to Kentucky to plead his son's case with the governor. Both Fairbank and Webster were back in the area a few years later. She moved to Madison, Indiana, an incredibly interesting town for anybody who's been to Madison, Indiana, every house has a historical marker. Every house except one which said, "Nothing in history happened here." I have a picture of it in my... She moved to Madison, Indiana, where she planned to open a school. She also bought a farm across the river in Trimble County, Kentucky, which she planned to cultivate using what she called free labor, but which slaveholders believed with some justification was to be the base from which to siphon off slaves. Fairbank returned in 1851, ostensibly to retrieve the remains of his father, who had died in Kentucky while trying to obtain his pardon. But it was clear that his decision had more to do with his deep-seated commitment to undermine the system by helping slaves to reach free territory. It was his way, he argued later, of putting, and this is his words, putting his hands against the authority of the state. He had first assisted a slave to escape in 1837. Tamar would be his last. None of the 47 he helped to escape were ever retaken. It was a proud accomplishment for which he spent 19 years in the state penitentiary. There, Fairbank met a man called Thomas Brown, a 57-year-old, and I give you Thomas Brown because, I mean, this is an old geezer in this period. 57 is not young in the middle 1850s. Brown was an itinerant peddler who was arrested in Henderson, Kentucky in May 1854 for helping 3 female slaves to escape to Canada. He was held in the notoriously unsanitary Morganfield prison for 12 months before his case was heard. Both Brown and Fairbank found the state penitentiary in Frankfort little better. It was called the Dark Hole of Calcutta. Brown spent 3 years there, forced to labor beyond his physical capabilities and age, and was sometimes flogged with a cat-o'-nine tail. Fairbanks confirmed the harsh treatment meted out to his abductor in the prison. He claimed, and he must have counted every one, he claimed to have received 35,105 lashes from a leather strap during his time in prison. It's either, for some people, a horrendous experience, some might find it enjoyable. I mean, it must come a time when you say, what are you doing after you pass the 3,000 lash? Brown was released in 1857, having served his full sentence. Like all other areas along the divide between slavery and freedom, Kentucky was fertile ground for those planning to aid the enslaved to reach freedom. That was particularly so because of the many black settlements that rimmed the northern counties along the Ohio. These pockets of black settlements are critical to an understanding and an appreciation of what has been called the geography of resistance. It was also in areas such as these that slaveholding interest organized to protect themselves. An association of Macon, Bracken, Pendleton, and Boone counties in Kentucky first met in late 1852 in the wake of a dramatic spike in escapes from the area. They took a census of slaves in the county, formed a committee whose sole responsibility was to pursue escapes, establish a fund to meet expenses associated with recapture, and hired a former resident, now living in Sandusky, Ohio, to keep an eye on those trying to reach Canada through the Lake Erie Port. Their efforts were effective at times, but it did not stop free blacks crossing in the area to aid slaves. John Parker played a critical role in the movement from his base in Ripley, Ohio. I made my, there's a house perched on a hill, an incredibly steep hill in Ripley, Ohio, which I made my family climb, just because I'm doing historical research. There was a lot of complaining. On a hot, steamy summer's day, climbing a hill. Why are you doing this, Dad? They asked. Parker, who was born enslaved in Norfolk in 1827, bought his freedom in 1845 and settled in Ripley, where he established a foundry. His home on Front Street, which abutted the river, was the first port of call for those seeking freedom. Parker worked closely with the Reverend John Rankin, whose home on the hill that we walked up, and everybody should do it, was the second line of defense. Given its location, the town was contested ground, as one former slave put it. There were, he says, devils and good people walking in the road at the same time. In addition to welcoming and assisting runaways, Parker made frequent trips across the river to bring out groups of slaves. It is estimated that he assisted 440 slaves to reach freedom between the year he settled in Ripley and at the end of the Civil War. It's impossible to quantify this with any exactness because people exaggerated, but I think it gives a feel for the extent of the operations and the activities that were going on. Downriver slaveholders, along with allies in the town, tried for many years to disrupt before finally succeeded in dispersing a vibrant underground railroad cell in Madison, Indiana in 1846. Pro-slavery men nearly drowned one of its operatives in the Ohio River. Another, George Batiste, a leading light, left for Detroit, where he carried on helping fleeing slaves across into Canada. The cell continued to operate, however, under another man called Chapman Harris. Another major player, a man called Elijah Henderson, moved his operation upriver to Lawrenceburg, where he continued to funnel escapes through Sandusky and Detroit. Light skin and able to pass for white, he managed to evade the attention of the authorities. In 1855, a Sandusky co-worker estimated that Anderson had led 800 escapees to safety in the space of 5 years, bringing out 20 and 30 at a time. In 1856, Anderson was caught in Carrollton, Kentucky, trying to take out the wife and 4 daughters of a freed black man. The Bedford County Court found him guilty and sent him to the penitentiary, the state penitentiary, the same one where Fairbanks was held, where he was found dead in his cell the day Lincoln delivered his inaugural address. His death was described as inflammation of the membrane of the heart. Others knew otherwise. Other areas along the borderland experienced similar incursions from supporters of the enslaved. In summer 1841, Alliston Walk, James Burr, and George Thompson, 3 students at the Mission Institute in Quincy, Illinois, crossed the Mississippi River into Missouri to help slaves escape. They were betrayed by those they came to help, were caught, tried, and sentenced to 12 years in the state penitentiary. A local editor was convinced that there existed a regular system organized by Illinois abolitionists to rob Missouri of its slaves. There were, another editor believed, emissaries of mischief. Further to the west in Boonville, Francis Morse was caught running off 3 slaves. Morse, suspected of being a Canadian, was sentenced to 5 years in a state prison. The plot thickened when letters were intercepted at the post office addressed to Charles, which showed he was not a slave but a free black named Robert Pelham, who, as one local newspaper put it, and it's an incredible idea, suffered himself to be sold the more readily to succeed in enticing runaway slaves. Think about that. You agreed to be sold so you could be taken into slave territory, so you could help slaves to escape. I mean, if I want to go into Missouri, I'd find other ways to do it also. Also found in Charles were notes in his own handwriting showing possible routes out of Missouri and distances between Alton, Illinois, and Detroit, Michigan, as if to add further mystery to what was already an unusual case. The letters to Charles mention a Lord Hamilton, an assumed code name of Moss. The mystery does not end there. 4 years later, a letter from Moss's parents, Elizabeth and John Rowe, postmarked from Alton, Illinois, pleaded with the governor of Missouri to pardon what they called their unfortunate son, known in the state prison of Missouri as Francis Moss, which implied that Moss was an unassumed name. Okay, I could go on like this, but let me do one more, because it involves a name that I'm sure is readily acknowledged and known to everybody in the room. 5 years later, Missouri was embroiled in another case of outside interference. Ill, John Brown had returned west to resume plans for his attack on Virginia's Harper's Ferry. In December, Jim Daniels, a Missouri slave, crossed into Kansas on the pretext of selling brooms. Meeting one of Brown's men, Daniels informed him that he and others were about to be sold and they needed help. Brown responded by leading 18 of his men into Missouri. One group raided the farmhouse of Daniel's master, freeing 5 slaves at gunpoint. They freed 5 more at a neighboring farm. Another group freed 1 slave and in the process killed her owner. The parties carried off oxen, horses, food, and clothes, followed by a state posse and with rewards offered for their recapture by President Buchanan. They trekked north, evading the posse near Lawrence, Kansas. The posse finally intercepted the group at a forge. Rather than retreat, Brown's men charged into the posse, forcing them to retreat. Brown gave chase, capturing horses and taking several prisoners. In February, the group left Kansas, going into Iowa. At Grinnell, they procured a boxcar in which they placed the fugitives and attached it to a train heading for Chicago, where they transferred to a train for Detroit, from where the group of 12 fugitives crossed into Canada. The journey of 1,100 miles took 82 days and was widely reported in the national newspaper, capturing the imagination of the public. So before Harper's Ferry, Brown was doing his deed in other parts of the country. And many of these stories can be replicated in other parts of the country, as slaveholders made whatever efforts they could to stymie the activities of these outside interferers, including such people as we all know as Harriet Tubman, who, as Benjamin Quarles nicely put it, was given to dreams and prayers. Tubman is estimated to have made at least 15 incursions into Maryland over the 11 years after her escape in 1849, leading out 200 to freedom. Pivotal to her success were black settlements scattered throughout the eastern shore of Maryland the Chesapeake Bay of Delaware, and eastern Pennsylvania and New York. There were others less well known. And let me end with a strange story. And it really doesn't have much to do with going into the South to help slaves to escape. But one of the people with whom Tubman worked was a man called the Reverend Samuel Green. I think Green was related to her in some way. But Green's son had recently escaped. Green was a slave and had bought his freedom. His son had, since then, had escaped to Canada. What drove the authorities of the Eastern Shore of Maryland to distraction was that slaves kept escaping right where Green lived, and they couldn't put their finger on it. And they tried for years, they tried for months to find out what was going on. Green, they also discovered, had gone off to visit his son in Canada. So in order to stop what they thought was this bleeding of property from this area, the authorities raided his home. They found maps with routes drawn to places how to get to Canada, train timetables, which shouldn't be suspicious, but under the circumstances, how to get out of the Eastern Shore of Maryland. They found a letter from his son saying, "Dad, it's time to get those slaves out that we were talking about." And they found a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin. They could not tie, in spite of all the collection of evidence, they could not tie Green to this specific set of escapes from this area of the Eastern Shore of Maryland. But they turned to an antiquated state law that had been written in the early 1840s, and they charged Green with the possession of abolitionist literature, which takes us back to our story about Dresser in Nashville. And for having a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I want you to appreciate this in this era of book banning. In having a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Green, the good reverend, was sent to prison for 10 years. Please let that soak in, and thank you. I assume I have to stand here and respond to questions if you have any. That's the way I used to intimidate my students. Nobody has questions. Yeah. But no, if you do, please. Yeah.
Why were the abolitionists selling their pamphlets? Why not just give them out?
No, they weren't selling the pamphlets. They were distributing the pamphlets. He was selling his Bibles.
Okay.
You know, you got to sell Bibles. You got to, and you wouldn't lock somebody up for selling Bibles. You shouldn't anyway. Yes, somebody over here.
Wouldn't that assume that a lot of slaves could read? And I didn't think that was legal.
Or it could be read to them. Yes, and there were lots of folks who could read, and I suppose to some extent many feared that by some kind of process of osmosis, if you hold the Bible, its contents would sort of flow into your system, even if you couldn't read a word of it. Yes.
I was reading something about slaves escaping to Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any information or knowledge about them leaving Texas to go to Mexico or the Underground Railroad system there?
Yes, there were. Anywhere you had, anywhere you had free territory that was close by, slaves had this horrible habit of wanting to go there. And Mexico had abolished slavery.
Yeah, and I also read that some people went to the islands.
Yes, yes, yes. Some went to, particularly after the British abolished slavery in 1833, people escaped to places like Jamaica, particularly the Bahamas. Because if you look at a map, one of the major routes of the domestic slave trade, which is the transferring of enslaved people from states like Maryland and Virginia, where there was an overabundance of slaves, to places where they were needed, like Louisiana and Texas and places like that. And that trade route went along from Virginia. It would go down the eastern seaboard of the United States, and there sitting all those islands very close by that make up the Bahamas. So in many instances, people took command of ships, or the ship may have blown off course, and those slaves were lost to people. And it created a lot of tension between the British and the United States over whether that property should be returned. The British said no. And that created problems. Yes?
Through all of this research, is there a percentage ever assigned to the number who successfully escaped and were relocated?
No, I've been asked that a lot. I wouldn't even hazard a guess. Because it's impossible. Because we know, as I said somewhere here, we know about these issues because the attempts failed. All right? Those who succeeded just got there and went away. And many settled into black communities in the Free States. Many went to Canada. Some went to Mexico. Some even went as far as England. Some went to some of the Caribbean islands. So it's impossible, it's very difficult to determine with any exactness how many people actually escaped. At least as a historian, what intrigues me is to find out the attempts to do something, not necessarily whether it succeeded or not. It's fun if it succeeded, but if it tells me something about the ingenuity of men and women to resist systems of oppression, and that's what interests me more. So I'm trying to understand, trying to tease it out, and that is the one way you can do it. Or you can go downtown to the public library and go through the court records, the circuit court records, where all these things are recorded in graphic detail. Yeah?
Like in the 1830s in Nashville, were there no religious leaders that were anti-slavery? It sounded like, from what you described about what happened here, it was just everybody supported slavery. Were there no ministers at all preaching against slavery?
No. There were people who were there were some people who supported freeing the slaves but sending them to Africa.
Oh.
For instance, Montgomery Bell is famous for that. He is one of the more prominent. There were other people, but Montgomery Bell was one of those who sent a significant number of his slaves, his enslaved people, to Liberia in the 1850s, and had plans to send more, but the old geezer died. He was a very irascible man, an interesting character. I know someone is working on a biography of Montgomery Bell, so I wait to see what he has to say. But, yeah?
Who's the person working on the biography?
He's a retired lawyer. His name, he took a class of mine that I taught for to people who didn't have anything to do. It was a fun class. For 6 weeks, they came and I didn't have anything to do and they didn't have anything to do, and we sat and talked about the Underground Railroad. And he was in that class, but and we.
Always asking was about the biography. There hasn't been one.
No.
Before.
There's never been, there hasn't been a biography of Montgomery Bell because
I wonder why.
Well, it's one of those things. There are lots of people who require biographies, and we haven't done anything about it because there are just too many people that require biographies. But Montgomery Bell, deserves one. I mean, he's the largest slaveholder in Tennessee. He owned.
He said kind of a strange character.
Yes. He was. He never married. He remained a bachelor, and there's nothing wrong with remaining a bachelor. but old Montgomery seemed to have been a free spirit. Let me put it that way. He may have had children by both. Let me say, he crossed the great divide sexually with amazing. He did it one way with. I don't know why we pull our punches. I said the man was having sex with white women and black women. What the hell? Oh yeah. But he also, as I say, as he was in his 80s, he started making plans to free his slaves and send them to Liberia. And he did. He ended up sending, I think, in excess of 80 people, some of them whole families. And he provided money for them to survive for a while they were in Liberia, to set up, because he was also an iron maker. He was a foundry maker. I mean, there's that wonderful tunnel that he and his slaves dug north of here. And they went to, many of them went to Liberia. And then while he was contemplating freeing additional slaves, he died in 1855. But he also established, he gave a bequest for the establishment of the school. If you look at, I got myself in trouble over this. If you look at the will, the phrase is for indigent boys. I rest my case.
I think we have time for one more, if there's one more question.
Yes, yeah, we could go on Montgomery Bell, yes.
Where did the concept of sending enslaved people back to Liberia come from? I've heard it a number of times over the years.
Yeah, well, it emerged just after, at the same time that America is thinking about its independence. So it begins to percolate in the late 18th century. Folks who were partial to emancipation argued that the freed people would not be able to survive in America. If you freed them, they would not be able to survive in America, because they argued that this was a society for white people and not for slaves. This was a racist society, and therefore these people would not be able to survive. And what you need to do is to give them an opportunity to spread their wings in a free setting away from their oppressors. And they would prove their mettle, they argued, and then they would be able to set a standard that others. So that's the positive side of colonization.
Why Liberia?
No, it was just, that's the place that that's the place that the first ship went. It wasn't called Liberia then. It was just part of West Africa. And the emissaries of the American Colonization Society seized that bit of land, and they called it, and the capital is named for the president, Monroe. So the capital is Monrovia. It's named for President Monroe. So that was the idea behind it. So it was a sort of emancipation effort with a twist. That you couldn't survive here, so you need to go somewhere else. It was the idea. I think that's, I'm told this is it. Thank you.